Can live forever.
Yes, sir.
How long? Not long.
How long?
Because you shall reap what you sow.
Yes, sir.
How long? Not long.
How long?
Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne.
Yes, sir.
Yet that scaffold sways the future. Than 20 or 25 years ago, in the North, schools are more segregated today.
Martin Luther King Jr., originally named Michael King Jr., was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He died on April 4, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. He was a Baptist minister and a social activist who led the civil rights movement in the United States from the mid-1950s until his death in 1968. His leadership was fundamental to that movement's success in ending the legal segregation of African Americans in the South and other parts of the United States. King rose to national prominence as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which promoted nonviolent tactics such as massive march on Washington in 1963 to achieve civil rights. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. While in Boston, King met Coretta Scott, a native Alabamian who was studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. They were married in 1953 and had 4 children. King had been pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, slightly more than a year when the city's small group of civil rights advocates decided to contest racial segregation. On that city's public bus system, following incident on December 1, 1955, in which Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, had refused to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger and, as a consequence, was arrested for violating the city's segregation law. Activists formed the Montgomery Improvement Association to boycott the transit system and choose King as their leader. He had an advantage of being a young, well-trained man who was too new in town to have made any enemies. He was generally respected, and it was thought that his family connections and professional standing would enable him to find another pastorate should the boycott fail. In February of 1959, he and his party were warmly received by India's Prime Minister and others, the result of a brief discussion with the followers of Gandhi about the Gandhian concepts of peaceful non-complaisance. King became increasingly convinced that non-violent resistance was his most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. King also looked into Africa for inspiration. The liberation struggle in Africa has been the greatest single international influence on American black students, he wrote. Frequently, I can hear them say that if their African brothers can break the bonds of colonialism, surely the American black can break Jim Crow. In an effort to draw together the multiple forces for peaceful change and to dramatize to the country and to the world of the importance of solving the U.S. racial problem, King joined other civil rights leaders in organizing the historic March on Washington on August 28th of 1963. An interracial assembly of more than 200,000 gathered peacefully in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal justice for all citizens under the law. Here the crowds were uplifted by the emotional strength and prophetic quality of King's famous I Have a Dream speech, where he emphasized his faith that all men someday would be brothers. Rising tide of civil rights agitation produced, as King had hoped, a strong effect on national opinion and results in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, authorizing the federal government to enforce desegregation of public accommodations and outlawing discrimination. In publicly owned facilities as well as employment, that eventful year was climaxed by the award of the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in December. King's plans for a Poor People's March to Washington were interrupted in the spring of 1968 by a trip to Memphis, Tennessee, in support of a strike that the city's sanitation workers. In the opinion of his followers and biographers, King seemed to sense that the end was near, as King prophetically told a crowd at Manson Temple Church, Memphis, April 3rd, the night before he died, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that tonight we as people will get to the promised land." The next day, while standing on a second-story balcony, Lorraine Motel, where he was and his associates were staying, King was killed by a sniper's bullet. As with the lives of other major historical figures, King's life had been interpreted in new ways by successive generations of scholars, many of whom have drawn attention to the other crucial role of local black leaders in the African American protest movements in the 1950s and 60s, recognizing that grassroots activists such as Rosa Parks, Fred Shuttlesworth, and others prepared the way for King's rise to national prominence. Biographers and historians have questioned the view that Southern black protest movements relied on King's charismatic guidance. Nonetheless, studies of King continue to acknowledge his distinctive leadership role. For example, though he often downplayed his contribution to the Montgomery bus boycott, King's inspiration, leadership, and his speeches helped transform a local protest over the bus seating into a historically important event. More generally, studies of King have suggested the most of his significant contribution to the modern African American freedom struggle was to link black aspirations to transcendent, widely shared the demographic and Christian ideals, while helping grassroots leaders immobilize African Americans for sustained mass struggles. He inspired participants to believe that their cause was just and consistent with traditional American egalitarian values. King also appealed the consciousness of all Americans, thus building popular support for civil rights reform. His strategy of emphasizing nonviolent protests and interracial cooperation enabled him to fight effectively against the Southern system of legalized racial segregation and discrimination.
Years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later,